David Parker.
Mr. Chairman, the history of this part is Chris Hipkins has already touched upon, is that after the Max Bradford reforms, we went through a period when lines companies were left unregulated. And there was a terrible mistake made by the then government that assumed that if you had a monopoly, you could have competition that would somehow constrain their price increases and that they would act appropriately. History sadly showed that that was wrong, or now shows that that was wrong. And what happened was that the lines companies did increase their prices, but they didn't invest in their infrastructure. This wasn't true of all lines companies around the country, but it was true in respect of some of the lines companies. They increased the prices to consumers, but rather than spending a fair proportion of the money that they collected on investment in their lines, they distributed it to their owners, who were sometimes councils. And as a consequence, consumers have ended up paying twice. They were left with rundown lines companies, and the Commerce Commission, who subsequently were appointed as a regulator of their businesses. I think it was the Commerce Commission, or was it the Electricity Commission? The Commerce Commission? Commerce Commission, I think it was, came in and regulated their returns. But they found that some of these companies, the cupboard was bare. And so although they'd collected revenue over the years that ought to have been able to have been spent on their lines, they hadn't spent it, and consumers were effectively forced by the Commerce Commission, forced by what had happened, to pay a second time and to pay those revenues to the lines companies, which were that second time under regulation from the Commerce Commission required to be spent on their the maintenance and replacement and extension of their lines capacity. When I was Minister of Energy, that state of affairs was explained to me by officials and indeed by members of the Commerce Commission, who acknowledged that that is what had happened in respect of some lines companies. So there is no doubt that that was a mistake in my view, and that Parliament under the last Labor government was right to introduce regulation of returns for lines companies, because they are absolute monopolies. You only have one set of lines, and it was always misguided to allow that industry to be deregulated. Now, the risk in respect of a monopoly enterprise, like a lines company, if you allow them to enter into other parts of the electricity market, is that they will cross-subsidise parts of their business using their monopoly rights as a lines operator. And so the tension that regulation of other activities by lines companies attempts to control is this risk that they will use their lines revenues to cross-subsidise either their retail margins if they're in retailing, or their generation businesses if they move into generation. Now, these risks are different depending on the ownership structure of the trusts, and I'd like to hear the Minister talk about what he sees as the difference between trust-owned companies, lines companies that are effectively owned by the cooperatives that are effectively owned by the people who buy electricity from them or through them. Those lines companies where they're actually owned by the local communities, if there is a monopoly rent being extracted, well, there might be some misallocation between users, but in general sense, the money's going back to the community if there's any excess prices, and I'm less worried about those ones. But some of them actually aren't owned in a sort of a cooperative sense like that. They're actually owned by councils, and councils own them as a source of revenue, and so they try and maximise that in a way that defrays rates. And at one level, you can see why they'd want to do that, but you can also see how that could act to the detriment of electricity consumers who have a different interest. They want to only pay a fair amount for their electricity. So one of the concerns that I've got here is the change in the amount of electricity that can be generated by a local lines company now before it has to have operational separation of their generation business from their ownership separation of their generation business from their lines business. That was proposed in the original bill that went to Select Committee to be 100 megawatts and has come back, recommended that they can have up to 250 megawatts of generation directly connected to the national grid before they have to have ownership separation. That is a lot of juice. That is more than 1 year's increase in demand in New Zealand's electricity. We are talking about a substantial amount of electricity. And so the competition, Mr Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
So I asked the Minister to take a call as to whether they are convinced that they will be protecting competition in the market. Now, I think the answer to this is that it doesn't. Well, you can argue on the one hand that it would be nice to have a few more people competing in investing in generation, and that's sort of going back to the old model that we had before Max Bradford, where we had local council-owned companies that both generated, retailed, and ran the lines company, the local lines company. And that makes some sense. But on the other hand, we're still maintaining the fiction that this is going to result in an effective market for the sale of electricity at wholesale and retail that will effectively constrain price. And I remain unconvinced of that, and I'd be interested to see whether the Minister can tell us from the Chair whether there's any modelling being done as to whether this extra generating capacity coming potentially from lines companies will have some impact on the differential between residential and commercial and industrial tariffs. The tariff that's paid by residential users in New Zealand has grown. The gap between that tariff and the tariffs paid by industrial users has grown very large over recent years, over the last decade, and I, for one, find it hard to explain. And I do have concerns that it's a pointer to there being insufficient competition in the market, and that this leads to inappropriately high tariffs being paid by residential consumers. I also would like to see whether there's any information that the Minister can give us as to whether there are plans by local companies and the likes of the Alexandra example that I gave earlier. I know that there's Pioneer Generation up there. Pioneer Generation is, I think, owned by a community trust, and it owns some generating assets up there, and yet it doesn't seem to have had any effect on retail tariffs for those people in Alexandra who not only have the Clyde Dam that I spoke about and the Roxburgh Dam that I spoke about on their doorstep, but they also have smaller schemes in and around the central Otago area run by Pioneer Generation, and despite all of those generation assets just being on their doorstep, they pay a higher tariff than most other parts of the country. So how increasing generation by the local lines company will what the impact of that will be on tariffs for those people, I'd like to hear from the Minister as to whether there has been any research done or any estimates done as to the effect of that will have on price. My suspicion is that the answer is that it won't have much effect. Actually, what would have a greater effect would be if the government, through its SOEs, just said that we've got a lower expectation as to rate of return on those assets. That would accord with what the Governor of the Reserve Bank was calling for about a year and a half ago, when he said that the expectations of infrastructure companies as to profitability were excessively high, which feeds into my concern that there is insufficient competition in this particular market, and that this tinkering with the market won't make a material difference to that state of affairs, and that as a consequence the price that especially residential and small commercial customers pay for their power will remain higher than is justified to their detriment. So, Mr Chairman, I would ask the Minister and the Chair to take a call as to what estimates have been made as to what will be the extra generation coming from these lines companies, and what reports the Minister has received as to the effect that will have on prices at both wholesale and retail for residential consumers and small commercial consumers.